Hey guys, welcome back to Ripe Stories. In this video, a sovereign citizen squatted in my cabin for months, convinced that he could legally claim it as his own. When I showed up to my property and told him to leave, he grabbed a shotgun and pulled the trigger. Here is how a peaceful mountain getaway turned into the most terrifying moment of my life. And the first one starts like this. So I bought my mountain cabin years ago, back when I still believed I would use it every other weekend. Life did not exactly shake out that way. I mean, work kept getting busier, the drive kept feeling longer, and before I knew it, the place became more of a seasonal retreat than anything else. Still, it was mine, I paid the taxes and kept the utilities running. The cabin sits a few miles off a dirt road far enough out that cell service fades in and out depending on which direction the wind is blowing. In the winter, the snow cuts it off almost completely unless you've got chains on your truck and a stubborn streak. Most years I don't really bother trying to push through it. I wait for summer, throw a couple bags in the car, and disappear into the mountains for a week. No noise, no crowds, no demands, just quiet. That routine worked fine for a long time. I would show up, unlock the door, air the place out, fix whatever the winter had knocked loose, and enjoy the solitude. Nothing dramatic ever happened up there. That was kind of the point though. Recently though, the winter ran longer than usual. Snow kept piling up on the access road, and every time I thought about driving up, another storm rolled in. I figured the cabin would be just fine. I mean, it always had been. Nobody lived close enough to bother it, and most people with sense didn't wander that far into the woods without a reason. It turns out though, not everyone has sense, and some people don't even wait for summer to venture up there. Anyway, now we got to the crazy part. At some point someone had apparently snowmobiled or hiked up while the place was still accessible, saw a cabin with no fresh tracks and convinced himself that he had found abandoned property. A guy who believed in all that nonsense about unclaimed land and squatters' rights, though I didn't know that yet. He broke in through the back window, made himself at home and stayed for months. He was not just squatting, he genuinely believed that he could claim my cabin. In his mind, unoccupied meant abandoned and abandoned meant free for the taking, and since he had been there through fall and winter and into spring, he figured that gave him some kind of frontier-era ownership rights. But of course, I didn't know any of this when I finally drove up for my usual summer break. The moment I turned off the main road and saw smoke drifting from my chimney, I knew something was very wrong. I got to the cabin and the first thing that hit me was the truck parked in my driveway. An old Silverado, beat to hell, doors mismatched, and one of those camper shells barely held together with bungee cords. Nobody should have been here. I don't rent the place out, I don't share keys, it is just mine. I walked up to the front door and put my key in the lock. It didn't turn. The lock had been changed, or at least my key didn't work anymore. Through the window I could see a deadbolt installed on the inside that definitely wasn't there before. I looked through the windows more carefully and inside was chaos. Clothes on the floor, food wrappers, empty cans, a mattress dragged into the living room. A camp stove was sitting on the hardwood like it belonged there. My tools and supplies were scattered across the table, so yeah, someone had been living there and from the looks of it for a while. I then knocked on the door. Hard. The door cracked open, chain still on. A guy in his 40s, greasy hair, camo jacket, half drunk from the smell of him, looked back at me like I was interrupting his day. Me, this is my cabin. Him, been here for a while, it is mine now. He didn't close the door, instead he turned back and grabbed a stack of papers off the table. Printouts, looked like, covered in dense text about property rights and legal mumbo-jumbo he had pulled from God knows what website. He waved them at me like they meant something. I didn't argue. I was not sure where to even start. I mean, empty gas cans were stacked by the door. He had clearly made trips down the mountain for refills. The guy had settled in like he owned the place. I scanned everything quickly. Half the shelves were emptied, the fridge had stuff that wasn't mine, and he had even moved one of my chairs into the window so he could look out at the driveway. He had gotten comfortable. Too comfortable. Me, you need to leave now. He laughed, not a real laugh, just a sort of smirk that comes from someone who genuinely thinks they are untouchable. Him, you are trespassing. I'm protecting my property, you need to leave. He started going off then, talking faster and getting more worked up. Something about how I had abandoned the property by not being physically present, which meant I had forfeited my claim under so-called natural law. He kept saying natural law like it was some kind of trump card for him, said something about adverse possession and how 6 months of continuous occupation gave him rights that superseded my corporate fiction of a deed. And then he really got going. Told me I was operating under admiralty law and that my property deed was just a contract with a foreign corporation, meaning the county government, I guess. He said he had filed his own claim with some made-up authority he called the Continental Congress, and that they recognized his sovereignty over this land. He kept waving those printouts at me, talking about the UCC and how he had sent notices to the county that they ignored, which meant they had accepted his claim by default. I just stood there trying to process what I was hearing. The guy genuinely believed every word coming out of his mouth. He was not just pretending. In his mind, he had followed some kind of legal process that made this cabin his, and I was the intruder trying to steal it from him. He then finally added, "I'm hereby evicting you from my property." Only later I learned that these types of nutjobs are usually called sovereign citizens. I've never had to deal with a moron like this before, so I was honestly baffled by what I was hearing. I backed up, took a deep breath, and instinctively moved my hand to rest on my jacket, right where my concealed holster sat on my hip. Not drawing, just being ready. I've dealt with idiots before, but this was not ordinary. He was not confused or lost, he thought this was his cabin. And he was ready to defend it. I should have just driven away and called the cops right then and there. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe I was too angry. Maybe I thought I could talk sense into him. It was just stupid. I backed up towards my truck, watching him the whole time, waiting, thinking, and planning. Because this was not going to be a normal conversation, and whatever I did next had to be smart or it was going to get ugly real fast. I stayed by my truck trying to figure out my next move. The guy was sprawled in my cabin like he had every right to be there, and for a moment I couldn't wrap my head around how brazen all of this was. Then he came back out, dragging something from inside. Shotgun, not aimed yet, but heavy in his hands, every motion radiating confidence like he had done this before. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I slowly moved my hand under my jacket to rest on my concealed carry. I never want to use it, but times like this are exactly why I have it. I warned him once, clear as I could manage even though my voice was shaking, put the gun down or I was gonna pull mine. He laughed and waved me off like I was just bluffing, confident he could push me out without consequence. He kept shifting the shotgun around, trying to look intimidating. It was working. I moved my jacket aside so he could see I was not bluffing about the gun, and my hands were trembling. I didn't want to let him take another step towards me. I don't know what would have happened if he had. For a moment, it looked like he might back down, then he smiled and brought the shotgun up, barrel pointed right at me. I drew my gun and brought it up, aimed center mass like I'd been trained. I was screaming at him to drop the weapon. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. He made the decision to pull the trigger. The shotgun went off. I think I screamed. Something exploded behind me, some bark or wood, I don't know. My ears were ringing so loud I couldn't hear anything else, and I pulled the trigger. I don't even remember aiming. He went down, grabbing his shoulder. I might have fired more than once, I honestly don't remember. Everything after that shot is just fragments in my memory. He somehow managed to stumble back into the cabin and slam the door. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the gun. I then got behind my truck and just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. He was screaming inside the cabin at first, but his voice got weaker and more incoherent as time went on. Something about my property and my rights, slamming doors and pacing around like he was trying to convince himself he actually owned the place. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I got in the truck and drove back down the access road for about 5 minutes until I had enough bars to call 911. I told them about the guns, about shots being fired, and that they needed to send somebody fast. When I tried to explain what happened, my words kept getting tangled up. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking questions and telling me to stay away from the cabin until officers arrived. I drove back up and parked at a distance, keeping eyes on the place. Not long after that, multiple sirens rolled up from down the hill. Relief hit me, but I did not relax. I knew this was going to be complicated. 4 patrol vehicles arrived almost simultaneously. Apparently, dispatch had sent every available unit when I reported shots fired. 6 deputies stepped out, hands near their weapons, scanning the cabin as they approached. I had carefully placed my gun on the ground next to the driver's side door of my truck as soon as I heard the sirens, and then stepped well away from it with my hands clearly visible, making sure they knew I was not a threat. I tried to explain what had happened, the break-in, the months he had been living in my cabin, the shotgun and the refusal to leave. My voice kept cracking. The deputies listened, clearly sizing up the situation. One of them radioed for medical backup as a precaution since shots had been fired and someone was wounded, standard procedure for any shooting incident. From behind their vehicles they shouted for him to come out with his hands up. But he kept pacing inside, yelling about being a free man and how they had no authority over him, also shouting about how I was sent by the government to kill him. The guy had completely lost it. Time stretched as the standoff continued. He banged on doors, peeked out windows, trying to maintain control. The deputies called for backup and I could see tension in their postures. They knew dealing with someone like this required patience, not confrontation. I was not totally off the hook though. They took my gun and had me sit in the back of a patrol car. I understood why, I mean they had to secure the scene, but it still felt a bit humiliating. They questioned me multiple times about what happened. The place was technically a crime scene, so it made sense, but sitting there in the back of that car felt surreal. More shouting at the cabin, more demands that he come out, and he was still yelling his nonsense. But his voice was getting weaker, and eventually, the door cracked open and he stumbled out without the shotgun. One hand pressed against his shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt and fingers. He looked pale and unsteady, the fight gone out of him. Whatever adrenaline he had had was long gone. One deputy moved in carefully, getting him cuffed while the other kept watch. He was still muttering about rights violations and legal nonsense, but quietly now, like he didn't have the energy anymore. They set him down on the ground outside to wait for the ambulance. Despite being shot, he was still refusing to give real information, going off about how the government had no jurisdiction over him, but his protests were weak. At one point he tried to pull free, twisting and shoving at the deputies, and they had to wrestle him back down to keep him under control. He was writhing and yelling about assault and treason, but it didn't last very long. By the time the ambulance arrived, he had gone quiet, just sitting there staring at nothing. The EMTs checked me over too before they left. Standard procedure, they said. I was not hurt, but I couldn't stop shaking. One of them asked if I wanted to go to the hospital anyway, get checked out for a shock or something, but I said no. I probably should have said yes. While all of that was happening, the other officers were searching the cabin and surrounding property. They were documenting the broken window he had used to get in, the changed locks, the altered doors, and the piles of junk he had accumulated inside. Nothing major was missing apparently, but everything had the mark of months of unauthorized occupation. Once he was loaded into the ambulance and driven down the hill, the sense of immediate threat finally passed. The deputies told me I couldn't stay in the cabin that night. It was an active crime scene. They'd need to process everything, collect evidence, document the damage. I got a motel room down in town and barely slept. It took over a week before they cleared the scene and removed the tape. The deputies said it was standard for a shooting. When I finally got back in, I spent the better part of another week cleaning up his mess and installing new locks. Better locks this time, the kind the hardware store guy recommended for vacation properties. I walked through the room slowly, taking inventory, assessing what had been moved, used or damaged. It wasn't much in terms of physical destruction, but the violation of it, the audacity, was infuriating. Nothing could replace the peace of mind he had stolen from me. I thought back to the months that he'd been living there, how he had convinced himself that my absence meant it was his. It was absurd and maddening at the same time. Months of rent-free living, months of pretending my property didn't belong to me, and months of building his own delusions. And yeah, I could see how it happened, how easy it might have been for someone like him to convince himself he was in the right, but still, the reality was undeniable. He had trespassed and he had altered my property. He had armed himself and threatened me on my own land, and for all his talk about being a free man and unclaimed property, he had no authority here. The law, the deed, and basic common sense were on my side. The sheriff called me a few days later with an update. The guy was facing multiple charges: criminal trespass, armed assault, unlawful possession after changing the locks, and a few other things I didn't catch all the details on. The sheriff mentioned he had run-ins with law enforcement before, though he didn't give me details. Something about disputes with neighbors and refusing to cooperate with code enforcement. I had to go down to the station twice more to give formal statements. My hands were still shaking when I signed the paperwork. They said the investigation would take a few weeks, but that everything pointed to clear self-defense. The shotgun blast into the tree, the spent shell casings, his wound matching my account, it really all lined up. They returned my gun after confirming my story matched the evidence. I put the gun in the glove box and haven't taken it out since. I'm not sure I want to. Standing there with the new locks installed, I thought I would feel relief, but instead I actually just felt sick. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him bringing that shotgun up. I wondered if I would ever be able to come back here without thinking about it. The guy was in jail though, my cabin was safe, and I had every intention of making sure it stayed that way. But I'll be honest, the quiet up here doesn't feel the same anymore. I keep looking over my shoulder, keep checking the driveway, keep replaying that moment when he pointed the shotgun at me. Maybe that will fade with time, maybe it won't. All I know is I did what I had to do, and I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about that. And now let's move on to the next story. It starts like this. I've been wanting to share this story about my neighbor for a while, and I'm just now getting around to it. To start things out really blunt, my neighbor is a total a-hole. Honestly, I know that Karens are considered women most of the time, but I think despite being a man, this guy has earned the title of Karen. He's just as entitled and stupid as every other Karen I read about. I have a small beach house I go to on weekends. It's my quiet place. Nothing fancy, just a simple one-story place near the dunes where I can relax, fish and get away from the noise of normal life. Most weekends it's just me, my truck and the sound of waves. The neighborhood is mixed, some full-time residents, some like me, who only come on weekends, and everyone mostly minds their own business, which is the way I like it. I know a few people enough to wave or say good morning, but that's about it. When I'm there, I keep things simple. The place is small, but I take care of it. I keep a few tools, some fishing gear, and a couple of red gas cans in a shed attached to the house. Technically, there's even a door to get into the shed from inside my house. No idea who built it like that, but oh well. I use the gas for my generator and sometimes for the boat. I just feel like it's important to make it clear that I do always lock my shed. Everything stayed quiet for a long time. I would go down for a weekend, do my thing and drive back home Sunday night. Never had troubles or issues. Karen was not the guy that I'd really noticed much before my issues with him. I just knew of him. I also noticed that he was stuffing flyers in people's mailboxes along a couple blocks, an invite to a party he was hosting, and he was boasting about a new deck he was building. I realize now that he didn't want to have a party to make friends, he just wanted to show off his new deck, which would be done by then, and brag about it. I also got invited and I didn't think I would go, but was going to keep it in mind. I might get bored enough to go after all. The next weekend I went down to the beach house like usual. Nothing felt off at first. I unloaded my cooler and gear, opened the windows and went out back to grab a couple of things from the shed. That is when I noticed the latch was hanging open. It had been cut and barely still hanging on. I removed it and opened the door. Everything looked fine aside from the fact that 2 red gas cans were gone. At first I stood there for a second just staring. I wanted to make sure they were actually stolen, so I looked everywhere I could think of that I might have placed them, but nothing. They were really gone. And yeah, I drink on the weekends, but I wouldn't have gotten so drunk as to just hide them or throw them out. There was no other conclusion. I looked around outside and noticed some faint tire tracks leading up along the side of the shed and towards the dunes. Obviously in the sand they disappear and I couldn't follow them. Even if it was tracks, there weren't going to be enough proof. Luckily, the cans were pretty distinctive. One has the handle basically totally wrapped in duct tape. I did not jump straight to accusing anyone, I just figured it was weird. Each can holds about 5 gallons. I was not gonna call the cops about 10 gallons of gas and 2 cans. That didn't mean I wasn't annoyed though. Somebody had clearly gone through my stuff and helped themselves. I thought about the only person who had been acting weird lately. And well, Karen, who was still leaving mail about his upcoming party and his new deck, was that person. I also noticed from his area the sound of power tools. Tools that just might need some fuel. And stealing is definitely cheaper than just buying gas yourself. I didn't want to believe he was the one who took them, but the timing was just too perfect, and I for sure didn't want to just bust in making accusations without any kind of proof. If I were wrong, I would look like the crazy guy. Later that afternoon I drove by his place on my way to the bait shop. I was not trying to spy or something, but couldn't stop myself from going a little slow and craning my neck to go get a good look. Sitting right there by his unfinished deck were 2 bright red gas cans, same brand, same size, and even with the duct tape around one of the handles from when it broke last summer. I pulled over for a second and looked just to make sure I was not imagining it, but nope, those were definitely mine. Karen was out there talking to a couple guys, probably about his precious deck. He saw me looking, gave me a half smile and raised his drink like we were old friends. That just made me more certain he had done it. Nobody acts that smug for no reason. I mean, maybe Karen is doing it, but it was just one of those you see the face and know it kind of things. I parked my truck a few houses down and walked over. I didn't go in yelling or anything, I just wanted to see what he would say when I asked. Me, hey, those gas cans, mind telling me where you got them from? Karen, what is that supposed to mean? Me, well, mine went missing and those look exactly like them. He didn't even look at me while he said it, just kept sipping his drink. Me, right, sure, you wouldn't have happened to find a pair lying around somewhere, right? Karen, look, I don't go snooping around other people's junk, I got these at the store. I knew that was a lie. They were clearly not new, but had wear and tear from time. Me, alright then, just thought I would ask. He smirked and went back to talking with his friends like I wasn't even standing there. I didn't have proof, not the kind you can take to the police anyway, but I knew that he took them. I could feel it in my gut. When I walked back to my truck, I told myself I would let it go for now. I was not about to start a shouting match over gas cans, but still, I took a couple pictures from the road before I left, just enough to show the can sitting there by his deck, clear as day. This was an issue I was gonna need to deal with myself. I might not be the person to call the police over these cans, but you can be sure I was the guy petty enough to get even. The thing about people like Karen is, they always give you a way to get back at them without much effort. He was really into bragging about his deck being built to anybody that would listen, the wood materials being used, the cost, anything he could boast about, and that bragging is what gave me an idea. That same afternoon, while I was sitting on my porch, I could hear him over the wind going on and on about his deck party. I guess he was showing off his new addition to yet another poor soul, just trying to take a walk. The way he talked, you would think he built the Taj Mahal or something. Now, I'd heard enough about permits and local rules over the years to know that you cannot just slap up a big deck near the dunes without one. There's a whole process for it because of erosion and zoning and all of that, and from what I've seen of his setup, I doubted that he had gone through any of that. The other thing I know about Karen is that they don't like following rules. Things like property and permits don't matter to them. He did not know that by bragging he gave me an idea, so that night I pulled up the local county website on my phone, searched for his address, and sure enough, there were no building permits listed whatsoever. That is when I started to grin a little bit. I'm not the type usually about to go full tattletale on somebody over gas cans in a normal situation, but if the guy wanted to steal my stuff and act like a jerk when caught, I was gonna show his overgrown ego a lesson. The next morning, I made a couple calls. One to code enforcement about possible unpermitted construction, and another to the non-emergency line about a planned loud event that might violate the local noise ordinances. I did not embellish anything, I didn't need to, I just gave them his address and said I was a concerned nearby resident. After that, I didn't think much about it. I cracked a beer, sat out on the porch and watched the sunset. The tide was rolling in, the breeze was perfect, and I honestly felt pretty good about myself. If he wanted to steal from me, fine, but it was not gonna be a one-way street, and if there's one thing I've learned, it is that karma does not need much help. It just sometimes needs to be pointed in the right direction, and for that I was happy to be karma's compass. I decided to stick around for a while to see this thing through. I didn't say it out loud, but yeah, I wanna see how things played out. A few days went by with the construction as loud as ever. I was worried my call did nothing, but about 3 days later, they showed up. Probably faster than normal since I was claiming it was a real safety issue. I sat on the porch with my coffee and waited, and sure enough, 2 county trucks eventually rolled up. One said code enforcement, the other one was a police cruiser. They parked right in front of his place. The inspector walked up with a clipboard and started asking the workers questions. I could hear parts of it from where I was sitting. Who's the homeowner? Where's the permit posted? You cannot work in a dune zone without authorization. Karen came storming out wanting to see what the holdup was, I guess. He tried to talk over the inspector, saying it was his property and he could build whatever he wanted. That went on about as well as you would expect. After a few more minutes of arguing, the inspector told the crew to stop all work immediately until a permit was approved. The officer stood nearby making sure everybody stayed calm. The workers packed up their stuff and left, leaving a half-built stack sticking out like a sore thumb. Karen was fuming. He kicked the bucket, threw a few boards around and stormed back inside. The music he had been blasting went silent, and 2 days later, his deck party actually happened anyway. Except now everyone got to stare at the half-finished deck roped off with yellow tape. He still tried to act proud, but it was hard to brag while the county's notice to stop work was clearly visible. By around 9, the noise picked up again, music, shouting, people laughing too loud. I didn't have to do anything this time though. Somebody else must have called about the noise since an officer showed up. The party started to really die down after that. I watched from my porch, beer in hand, feeling like karma was right on schedule here. The next morning, the neighborhood felt calmer. The music and shouting were gone, replaced by the sound of waves and gulls again. Karen's yard looked like a storm had rolled through. Cups, trash, a broken chair leg stuck in the sand, and the half-finished deck sitting there, taped off like a monument to bad decisions. I'll admit, it was a nice view from my porch. When I went to grab something from the shed, I noticed 2 red gas cans sitting neatly beside the door right away. Only half full, but otherwise exactly as I had them before. I didn't need to be a detective to know how they got there. A short note was taped to one handle. It said that he had borrowed them for a quick job and meant to bring them back. No signature, but he didn't need one. I just shook my head. After all that noise, the attitude, the lies, the party, this was how he tried to fix it. Quietly slipping the cans back like nothing had happened. I guess even people like him have their limits once the spotlight hits them. I locked them up again and went back to the porch. The tide was moving in, the air was still, and for the first time that weekend I felt like things were back to normal. From then on, he kept his distance, no more bragging, no more flyers in the mailbox, and no more shouting over the dunes. He walked his dog past my place a few times, but didn't look my way. The deck stayed half-built for weeks before finally getting finished, but this time with a proper permit posted on the post outside. I never said a word to him about it again, didn't need to. The gas cans being returned said enough, and after that weekend everything went back to how it would have been. Peaceful. The beach sounded like the beach again instead of a construction site or a bad concert. I spent the rest of the summer doing what I always came here to do, which is relax and mind my own business. Karen still lives a few houses down, but you wouldn't know it now. He doesn't talk much, doesn't wave, and definitely doesn't brag anymore. Sometimes I would see him sitting on his deck with a beer, quiet and looking out at the water. Maybe he finally figured out it's better that way. It's funny how people like that always end up learning the hard way. He could have avoided everything by just asking to borrow some gas, but instead he got the county involved, had his big party shut down, and embarrassed himself in front of everyone. I didn't need to rub it in, watched him dealing with the fallout was good enough. These days when I pull up to the beach house and see the shed door shut tight, I still check the lock just out of habit, but my gas cans have stayed right where they are supposed to be. And the next one is titled, "You want a man to help you? No problem. One will clock in soon." So this happened 16 years ago, when I was about 20 years old. I was a department manager in a big box hardware store. People said I acted 25, but I didn't even look 18. As a young woman, I saw my fair amount of sexual discrimination, but the worst always came from other women. This is the story of one such woman. I managed a paint department. I had 3 associates who worked for me, and they loved me as a boss because I bought them a department radio and took the shifts they didn't want. For context, I worked Friday closing and Saturday mid, so my 2 younger guys could have time to have fun on Friday nights, and the older gentleman took early Saturday mornings so they could sleep off their fun. In trade, I gave the older gentleman his ideal schedule. My team was awesome. One day I was in the department alone and a lady came up and asked me where she could find the 5-gallon oil-based primer. I let her know that my location didn't carry the 5-gallon size of that primer. She told me that we did and said that it was shelved right there, while suggesting I was too stupid to remember. Her husband gave me an apologetic look, by the way. I let her know that another location had what she was looking for and that it was in fact that exact location in that store. She let me know how stupid she thought I was for thinking she could mix up stores. Then she began yelling and loudly insisting that I get a man out there to help her because she wanted someone competent and not a stupid little girl. Her husband actually tried to step in at that point, but I just smiled and let her know that a male paint associate would be clocking in any minute and that I would be happy to direct him to her as soon as he is on the clock. I smiled and waited for Joe to clock in. Joe was great. I knew he could handle this, so I wouldn't have put him in this situation, but Joe was also new. So he was learning things super quick, but still relied on the rest of us for help. When I saw Joe walking up, I quickly said that there was a customer who needed help. I let him know that she was upset and asked him to do his best to answer her questions. Joe walked up to the lady. She said, "Finally a man." She asked her question and explained where the product should be and waited. Joe calmly let her know that he had never seen us carry 5-gallon size of oil-based primer, but said he could check with the paint department manager. So then, she was happy and loudly said that she was happy to be getting some real help. Joe walked up to me and started to ask me about the 5-gallon oil-based primers. The lady quickly walked up and asked him what he was doing. He turned and said, "This is my manager, she runs this department." The husband laughed out loud, the woman stormed off, and I bought Joe lunch. And the next one is a petty revenge story that is titled, "I keep misspelling my coworkers' names." So I got a corporate job that requires me to write several emails a day to sales reps. Sometimes these reps have to get back to me, and when they do, they always misspell my name. For reference, I don't have a hard name, but it's different than how a lot of people spell it. It would be like if you spelled Sean S-E-A-N. It is correct, but just less common. Anyway, what bugs me is that on Outlook, they literally have to search my name, meaning they have to find me by my correctly spelled name, but when they address me in the email, they misspell it. To alleviate this problem, I've been purposely spelling people's names wrong, and when I address them in emails. An Austin might be an Austin, a Don might turn into a Dan, stuff like that. It is small, but so far, it's been effective at making sure they don't do it again. And yeah guys, thank you for watching, please don't forget to subscribe and I will see you again tomorrow.